Okay, so we're ready to start on the first stage of the milling of boards, and that always means that we have to create one reference face or surface. It makes a little bit more sense to start with the broadest side here, this being the face of the board. We're going to flatten this. Once this is truly flat, then we can start working on the smaller sections, the edges, and then cutting down the length, truing up the ends when we need to. But it all starts with the largest surface here, the face. So in talking about preparing this, this is still very rough sawn, and you probably can't pick up on this from the at all. No. There's a really rough surface here. This came straight from the sawmill this way, and so there's no way I can do any milling, any joinery, any gluing up, really nothing. So I do have to get this trued and flat. So that's what I'm going to be doing with this one. I've got some options though with how or what tools we're going to use to do this. We talked about hand planes, or Sean did in an earlier video, and so we have some choices to make. I always look at this process and think about the best tool for doing the application that I want. So I have in my hand number 3, which is roughly 9 inches in length, and that's great. Yeah, 9 inches. That's great, but a board that's 3 times the length, roughly, 1, 2, almost 3. This shorter plane is probably going to have a tendency of finding the highs and lows that are inherent in the board. So I think because of that, I'm going to rule out the number 3 as just not being a large enough size for the task at hand. Number 4 plane, I think it's a little bit longer than the 3, a little bit wider, and I think it's kind of the go-to for most woodworking applications. So I like the number 4 for this. If this is the only plane you have, and I would recommend everybody own at least a 4, I think you could do all the tasks with this plane. But in comparing the 4 and then the 5, I guess maybe you can't see that, the 4 and the 5, there's substantially more length in the 5 than there is in the 4, much greater than the 3 to the 4. So because of that, I really like what the number 5 plane does for me, also referred to as a jack plane. It's a better length, better suited for really flattening and avoiding getting into that up and down motion of finding highs and lows. This will just kind of skate across all of them and really address getting this thing flat. So I'm going to go with the 5. A couple things with the hand plane. I want to make sure that I have a good amount of blade extended from the sole or the bottom of this thing. And what I'm looking for is I want to find a reflective surface, and I want to sight down the sole of the plane and see if there's a good surface here that will tell me when I advance the blade how much of that iron's exposed. And if there's not enough, then I'm going to start, well, I'm going to get nowhere fast. I'm not going to do any cutting. So I want to sight down the sole of this until I just see a little shadow created by that blade extending out of the sole. And I also want to make sure that it's parallel to the sole, and so if it is, I'm in good shape. If not, this little lever adjuster, this is what I will correct and make sure that it's parallel to the sole. I can only do so much by gauging this by eye, and so what I've done instead is I have this little, it's maybe a ½ inch thick, and thinner is probably better, piece of maple clamped into the vise. What I'm going to try to do is plane something here, and that was on the left side of the iron. I'm going to leave that in place. I'm going to take another pass on the right side, and you'll see that I'm getting a substantially smaller or thinner cut over there than I did with the first cut. This is a little bit heavy. This one is about right. So in order to balance this out, I'm going to push this lever in the direction where I'm taking a heavier pass. So I've done that. Retrying this. So fairly decent cut, very thin. This one is maybe just a little bit thicker than that other one, but I can at least tell that I'm getting cuts on both sides of the plane, and that's what I want. So I like this setting. Next thing I want to do is make sure that this board is going to be held in place, so when I'm planing, it doesn't move around the bench. So I've got, well, this is a bad example. It's not a bench dog, but this is what I use to remount. Sorry, you can't see that. Remount my light. So there's a hole in there. I could reposition my light into any of the bench dog holes that I have, and that's what that thing's about. But if using this as an example shows or over explains what I'm trying to avoid, that if I have a bench dog that is extending out of the surface of the bench shoe high, this is really going to limit where my plane can travel, because it's always going to bump into that or knock into that thing. So this, again, not a bench dog, but given the example about where I want my bench dogs to be. This one, very low profile, it'll hook onto the end of this bench, or this board in the bench, and then lock it into place. I've got something else for the other end, which is, oops, get down there. It's an adjustable bench dog, which is helpful for working in the center of the bench, which sometimes you need to do. So this little peg goes into the bench dog hole. I advance this screw until I get it nice and tight to where I want it. And if I've done that, this thing's not going to go anywhere, and that's exactly what I want. Okay, I think you can see all that. Okay. So running my plane over this board, I'm starting to get little tiny shavings, and that's good when I'm, there we go, when I'm starting out on this process. That's about what I'm looking for. It's just going to take off the highest high points on this board, and I'll continue to do that until I've gotten this thing flat. And I want to watch what's happening, what's coming out of the mouth of the plane, because if I'm taking out too much, it's going to give me a lot of resistance as I'm using this plane. If it's not enough, I want to see that, and I'll hear it, but also feel it. You'll notice that when I'm using this plane, I'm not always going in line with the board like so. I'm running diagonally, but from this one left to right, I'm tearing off a good amount of material. I'm getting more consistent shavings now. It's starting to fill up the plane, which tells me I'm getting flatter. Then I'm going to go diagonally the other way. I think the biggest issue that folks run into when using a hand plane to flatten the board is that they start in this one spot, usually closer to their body because it's easiest, and then they start to broadcast out here to various corners. The problem with that is that you're always starting in the same location, so this is always going to be thinner than anywhere else. So it's important to really explore all the space of this board with the plane. If I stay in one place, I know that's going to be my low spot because I've taken off more material than I need. Just advancing a little bit more blade. There we go. Now we start getting some real shavings. So the shavings I'm getting, they're kind of break apart here a little bit, which tells me they're really thin, which is good. But I'm getting consistent shavings from one end to the other. That is much more beneficial in telling me where I'm making progress, where I'm not. Should also mention that when you're planing, you need to be sensitive to the grain orientation here on the board. It's easy for me to go in this direction because the grain on the edge, you can't really see it from the camera. I'm going to overemphasize it. it starts off from my right to my left, going low to high. And that tells me that the run out of this material, or the run off, I should say, I'm going in the direction where that fiber leaves the board. If I were to plane in the opposite direction where those fibers are coming out, it's going to be much tougher to push the plane and a much greater propensity for a tear out to happen here. So I want to go in that direction. Sometimes it's tough to read the grain, or you'll mount the board where you think it's going to be highest rate of success, and then you start getting a lot of tearing out as you're pushing. Easy enough, just flip it around and go the opposite direction. A nice double check is to run your fingers down the board, and you can feel if it's a smoother, even with rough sawn material, if it's smoother to push in this direction, it's where those fibers are laying down. If I were to drag my hand going the other way, I can feel those little fibers that are standing up here. It's similar to petting a cat, or yeah, that's the example everybody uses, so might as well stick with that. It's much rougher dragging it across this way, so I know that if I were to plane this way, I'm going against those fibers because they're standing up, and so I know I'm going to get tear out. And at the very least, it's going to be tougher to push. So, continuing going down here, a sharp blade makes a huge difference with this. If I have a dull blade, I'm not really engaging that plane into a cut that is actually doing any severing of fibers. If it's a dull blade, it's more or less rounded out on that cutting edge. And so if it's really dull, that blade, when it comes out of the plane, is not cutting on the very tips here. It has a more rounded surface. So you have to extend so much more blade for that to find the sharp part of where the end of that iron is. And then you're going to nothing, and then it's going to grab, and it's going to grab out a big chunk. Okay, so I'll continue to do this. Using your hand plane as a straight edge, I can lay this down. I can see where the high spot is in the center of this, and so I want to kind of rock my plane back and forth, and I can tell that right in the center, for the most part, still have a high spot. So instead of trying to remember where all these high spots are, I'm using my pencil on the corner of this hand plane, and that will allow me to know exactly where to plane all the way across this. To double check, I just want to have or set the plane in the opposite orientation, and that gives me a more true reading and understanding what's happening here. Again, I don't want to guess. I want to remember exactly where to plane these things off, and then when the marks are gone, then I'll recheck for flat. And it's about holding the plane. I have to hold it at an angle here because that's where light can sneak through, and then I can see it coming out to where the high spots are. If I were to just lay the plane flat like so, there's so much more surface there. I really don't get a sense of where that light's coming in. So holding up diagonally, making marks, that's what I want to do. Marks are just about gone. Got a couple more in the center, but that's okay. I want to recheck. Still a high spot there. High spot there. I'm trying to match the length of my pencil line to where those high spots are, so I'm really only cutting where I need to cut. If I draw this line all the way from edge to edge on this board, then I'm going to get a false reading because I'm taking off way more material than is warranted. All right. So in the process of truing this board up, all of my marks now are gone. It's worth pointing out something about the technique that I failed to mention. When I start my cut, the iron is well off of the end of the board. If I were to start planing with that blade engaged, I'm automatically going to start to cut deeper in the center, or start dishing the board. So I want to pull the plane back, keep good pressure down on the knob in the front, and then the tote, or the rear hand, is just going to be driving this thing forward. If I don't do it this way, it's going to be very easy to start creating a high spot in the center, because I'm basically not putting the pressure down where I need it. So hold down, the blade is off the end of the board, go all the way through the cut until I'm way past that point of contact. I'm getting better shavings here and much greater length. The thickness of these things is decent. Can you see that? I don't know if you can. But fairly thin shavings, which is what I want. I don't want to remove a ton of material because it's a lot more work. It's not really doing you any good to take a large amount of material out at the moment. I just want to take out the high spots. So be strategic about this. Only remove material where you need to. Anything else is just going to give you trouble later on. Okay, so in checking this, I've got a nice flat area here on both orientations, so I don't want to remove any more material there. What I'm going to do now is a slightly different process. I'm going to start with the blade off the end. I'm going to keep going, keep going, keep going, and then I'm going to raise this thing up like an airplane taking off. So I don't want to make any contact in that area that's already flat. I just want to remove the high spots before it and then after it. So starting the same way I did, lining up with my marks, cutting, 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 and then raising it up. That's a couple of good ones. That's great. Now on this last little section here, there's maybe 4 inches at the end. I will start the iron right on the flat spot, push down, and then just kind of clean up those last little bits. And if I was lucky, looks like I've got a good section there to deal with. Got a little spot there. Cool. So a little bit here I need to remove. I'm going to start with the plane on the body of the board. And I think that's where I need you to go. So 2 ways to check this. I can visually sight down the edge of this board to see that there's no peaks or humps, and that looks decent. The other thing I can do, it doesn't work on a wooden bench, but I'll take this to any metal surface, so table saw bed, jointer bed, anything that has been machined, and I can check for wobble pushing corner to corner. Since this is a wooden bench, the wood moves. I'm not going to trust this because it could be funky. I could have dried glue on here. I could have dented or damaged the bench at some point. So all of these reasons kind of draw me away from that. But just in a couple minutes, and I made it, admittedly, I made it look easier than it is. It is a process that takes time. But the surface quality here is no longer any rough material, and I've taken off most of the high spots. At this point, this is ready for the next step, which is running through the planer. This is all I want to do. I don't really care if I do have tear on this. I just need to make sure it's flat and ready to be run through the machines. So if I've done this, then I've done my job with the hand plane. I will show you how to true up one of the edges here in a second, but